She was 24 when Owen Hart left. He did not say goodbye. He did not leave a letter on the pillow or have a final, cutting argument in the hallway. He simply waited for her to leave for a client consultation across town, a 2-hour meeting to discuss the conservation of a set of water-damaged Biedermeier chairs. When she returned, the apartment locks had been changed. On the cracked concrete sidewalk in front of their building sat her 2 professional tool chests, heavy, scarred maple boxes her mother had helped her build. On top of the upper chest was a single white envelope. Inside was a typed note, crisp and impersonal, like a memo. It informed her that their joint accounts had been closed, the funds transferred. It stated that the lease, which was in his name, would not be renewed for her. It wished her well in her future endeavors. He took the Danish modern sofa they had picked out together. He took the commissioned paintings from local artists. He took the hand-thrown pottery, the signed first editions, the vintage stereo system, and every bottle of wine from the rack. He took everything that had a clear, documented, and appreciable market value. He had conducted the dissolution of their life together with the bloodless efficiency of a corporate restructuring. He had liquidated the assets. He forgot the old carriage house her mother left her. He had never asked about it, not really. She had mentioned it once, a workshop her mother had owned in Vermont, and he had nodded, his eyes distant, already calculating. He had called hand restoration a beautiful craft, but one with no scalable economic model. It was a hobby, not an asset. So he forgot. She had grown up understanding wood the way some children grow up understanding silence in a library or the specific cadence of a parent's footsteps. It was a language to her, a living history written in grain and fiber. She understood the tight, stubborn rings of old-growth oak that spoke of slow, hard centuries. She knew the pale, yielding generosity of pine and the deep, resonant blush of cherry wood that darkened with age and touch, holding the memory of sunlight and human hands. This understanding was not taught so much as absorbed, breathed in with the dust of the workshop and the scent of linseed oil and beeswax. It was a legacy passed down not through words, but through the quiet observation of her mother's hands. Her mother, Clara, had been the source of this language, the keeper of its grammar and its poetry. Clara Voss was a woman carved from the same resilient, patient material as the forests her ancestors had left behind in Germany. The Voss family had been cabinet makers, carvers, and joiners for generations, people who believed that the soul of a thing resided in its making. They brought this belief with them across the ocean, a quiet, unshakable faith packed away with their heavy, specialized tools. Clara inherited not just the tools, but the philosophy. She believed that to repair something was an act of profound respect. It was a conversation with the original maker, a promise to the future that this object, this story, would endure. She saw the breaks and fractures in a piece of furniture not as flaws, but as chapters in its life. A water ring was a memory of a careless evening of laughter. A deep scratch was a child's secret game. Her job was to integrate these stories, to heal the wounds without erasing the scars. She was a conservator, a custodian of memory. After Nora's father left when she was just a toddler, a quiet and unremarkable departure that left little trace, Clara had raised her alone, supporting them both with the steady, methodical work of her hands. She never spoke of hardship. She simply worked through it, her resilience ingrained as deeply as the grain in the wood she so loved. Years after settling in a small Vermont town, Clara found the Carriage house. It stood at the edge of a forgotten estate, a relic of the 19th century left to sag and weather. The main house had burned down decades before, leaving only a stone foundation choked with weeds. But the Carriage house, built of stern granite and massive post and beam timbers, had survived. To others, it was a ruin, a liability. To Clara, it was perfect. She saw the good bones, the honest construction, the northern light that fell in long, gentle shafts through the dusty hayloft windows. She bought the small parcel of land it stood on for a pittance from the town, a transaction most locals considered an act of profound eccentricity. For Clara, it was not a financial investment, but an act of claiming a place in the world. She spent a year making it sound, replacing the slate roof herself, reglazing the tall, multi-paned windows, and reinforcing the massive sliding doors. It became her sanctuary and her workshop, a place where the air itself seemed to hold the scent of curing wood and the quiet hum of focused creation. It was there, during long, slow summers, that Nora learned the family trade not through formal lessons, but through proximity and osmosis. She learned to sweep the floors, to gather the fragrant curls of wood from the lathe, to hold a board steady while her mother sawed. She learned the names of the tools, the chisels and gouges, the block planes and spokeshaves, and the specific sound each one made against the wood. She learned the patience required to apply 17 coats of hand-rubbed shellac, the focus needed to carve a perfect dovetail joint, the gentle touch required to coax a warped piece of wood back into true. Nora had carried that knowledge with her to the city, building a small but respected business of her own, working with collectors and museums who understood the value of what she did. And it was in the city that she had met Owen. He was a brand strategist, a man who spoke in a language of metrics, analytics, and market penetration. He was handsome, confident, and attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He seemed to see her, to value her quiet competence and the unique skills she possessed. He called her an artisan, a creator, a word that felt both flattering and slightly inaccurate. In the beginning, his world of clean lines, strategic narratives, and quantifiable success was a fascinating counterpoint to her own world of patient, tactile, and often messy restoration. He organized their lives into neat, efficient systems. He managed their finances, planned their social calendar, and curated their apartment until it looked like a page from a design magazine. For a time, it felt like stability. It felt like care. But slowly she began to understand the particular quality of his vision. He saw the world not as a place of stories and textures, but as a collection of assets to be managed. He loved her work not for the craft itself, but for the story it allowed him to tell about them as a couple, the brand strategist and the artisan. It was a compelling narrative. He would bring clients to her small city workshop, showing off her skills as if they were a unique feature of a luxury product he had acquired. He loved the idea of her, the aesthetic of her, more than the reality. The reality was sawdust in her hair, the permanent stain of wood varnish under her fingernails, the long, quiet hours of solitary focus. He never asked about the history of a piece she was working on, only what its value would be upon completion. He never asked about her mother, about the Carriage house, about the generations of knowledge that flowed through her hands. Those things had no place on a balance sheet. They were not scalable. And so, in the end, when he decided their shared enterprise was no longer profitable, he divested, taking everything he could count and leaving behind the one thing he had never understood was priceless. After 2 hours of sitting on the curb beside her tool chests, watching the city traffic flow past like an indifferent river, Nora made a decision. She used the last few $100s she had in her personal account, a small emergency fund Owen had not known about, to hire a van. She loaded her tools, her suitcase of clothes, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Vermont. The journey was long and anonymous. She sat by the window and watched the dense urban landscape dissolve into suburbs, then exurbs, then finally into the rolling green hills and dense forests of the state she had not seen since her mother's funeral 2 years prior. Each mile felt like a shedding of a skin, a slow retreat from Owen's world of sharp angles and cold surfaces back into a world of organic shapes and quiet, living things. The bus hissed and rumbled, a mechanical beast carrying her away from a life that had proven to be an elaborate fiction. She did not cry. The shock had frozen the grief into a hard, cold knot in her chest. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean, but also strangely calm. There was nothing left to lose. She arrived in the small town of Northwood as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and pine, a scent so familiar it felt like a physical embrace. She took a taxi to the office of Mr. Abernathy, the town's only lawyer, a man whose family had handled the legal affairs of his neighbors for 3 generations. He was a kind, elderly man, with a gentle face and eyes that had seen the full spectrum of small-town life. He had been a friend of her mother's. He had handled the probate of Clara's will, and he was the custodian of the key. "Nora," he said, his voice warm with a genuine sympathy that felt more comforting than any words of condolence could have been. He didn't press for details about why she was there, her single suitcase and tool chests standing by the door telling their own quiet story. "Your mother would be so glad you've come home." He retrieved a small, unassuming box from his safe and placed it on the polished surface of his desk. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, heavy iron key. It was ornate and old, the kind of key that suggested it unlocked not just a door, but a history. "The deed was transferred to your name 2 years ago. It's all yours. The taxes are paid up for the next 5 years. Clara saw to that. She always planned ahead." He looked at her, his expression soft. "She always said that house was waiting for you, for when you needed it." The taxi took her the final few miles down a winding dirt road, the headlights cutting a tunnel through the deepening dark. And then she saw it. The carriage house stood silhouetted against the last light, a dark, solid shape at the edge of a wide meadow. It was larger than she remembered and more weathered. The granite walls were streaked with moss, and vines had begun to creep up the sides, but it stood straight and true. Its form was simple and honest, a testament to the people who had built it to last. She paid the driver and then stood alone in the quiet, the sound of crickets and the whisper of wind in the tall pines the only welcome she received. She walked to the massive sliding doors, her tool chests feeling impossibly heavy. The iron key felt cold in her hand. She found the smaller service door set within one of the larger ones. The key slid into the lock with a rusty grinding sound. It was stiff, resistant. She had to put her shoulder into it, turning with all her weight until, with a loud, protesting clank, the mechanism gave way. The door swung inward into a vast, deep darkness that smelled of time itself. It was the scent of old wood, cold stone, hay dust, and something else, the faint, lingering aroma of turpentine and shellac, the ghost of her mother's work. She stepped inside, pulling her belongings in after her, and closed the door, shutting out the last of the dying light. For a moment she stood in absolute blackness, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was home. Using the flashlight on her phone, she did a slow, sweeping survey of the space. The ground floor was immense, a cavernous room paved with thick stone flags. In one corner sat her mother's primary workbench, a colossal thing made of 4-inch thick maple, its surface a geography of cuts, stains, and burns. It was covered in a thick blanket of dust, but it was there, waiting. Along the walls were racks of tools, most of them dark with a fine layer of rust and stacks of lumber cloaked in cobwebs. A few half-finished projects stood like silent statues under dusty canvas dropcloths. It was a space that had been full of life and purpose, now sleeping, waiting to be woken. A steep, sturdy staircase led up to the hayloft, which her mother had used for storage and for the slow, careful process of air-drying wood. Nora ascended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the profound silence. The loft was even larger than the ground floor, stretching the full length and width of the building. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Stacks of lumber were neatly arranged on racks, each pile separated by thin wooden stickers to allow for air circulation. There were planks of walnut, cherry, oak, and bird's eye maple, a treasure trove of raw material her mother had collected over decades. And it was then that she remembered a game they used to play, a childhood secret. Her mother had called it Finding the Treasure. There was a loose floorboard somewhere in the loft, a secret hiding place. She started at one end, methodically tapping each wide plank with the heel of her boot, listening for the subtle change in sound from a solid thud to a hollow echo. The loft was vast, and it took her nearly an hour of patient searching, the narrow beam of her phone's light her only guide. Finally, near the far wall, behind a stack of burled maple, she found it. One board gave a distinctly hollow knock. She knelt down, her fingers finding the slight gap along the edge. Using the tip of a screwdriver from her pocket, she carefully pried it up. The board lifted easily, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity beneath. And inside that cavity sat a box. It was a masterpiece of joinery, crafted from flame birch and rosewood, with intricate dovetail joints at every corner. There was no lock, but the lid was sealed tight. She knew at once it was her mother's work. She lifted it out. It was heavy, solid, filled with a dense, promising weight. She carried the box downstairs and set it on the dusty workbench, the place where it had likely been born. She found a small pry bar and, with a surgeon's care, worked it into the seam of the lid. The wood resisted for a moment, and then, with a soft crackle of old glue, it gave way. She lifted the lid. The interior was lined with dark green felt. On top lay a thick, sealed envelope, her name written on it in her mother's elegant architectural script. She set the letter aside, her fingers trembling slightly. Beneath it, the box was filled to the brim. On one side were neat, tightly bound stacks of old paper currency, 20s, 50s, and hundreds, held together with brittle rubber bands. On the other side, nestled in custom-carved hollows, were gold coins, Krugerrands, and American eagles, their surfaces gleaming dully in the beam of her flashlight. She sat down on a dusty stool and began to count. She counted methodically, making small stacks on the workbench. The cash amounted to $30,000. The gold coins, she estimated, were worth at least another 15. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was more than enough. It was enough to begin again. Finally, her hands now steady, she picked up the envelope. She slit it open with a chisel, the sharp steel slicing cleanly through the thick paper. Inside were several pages of her mother's workshop stationery, the paper heavy and cream-colored, bearing the faint embossed logo of a block plane. The letter was dated just a few months before her mother's sudden death from an aneurysm.
"My dearest Nora,"
it began.
"if you are reading this, it means you have come to the Carriage house because you needed to.
I am sorry I am not there to welcome you myself. I hope that whatever brought you here will, in time, prove to be a beginning, not an end. This place has been my strength, and I leave it to you in the hopes that it will be yours as well. It is built to last, and so are you. You have the blood of makers in you and the hands of a healer. Never forget that. The money in this box is for the practical things. Life requires practicality. It will be enough to fix the roof, to pay the taxes, to buy the groceries. It is a tool, nothing more. Use it to build a foundation. The real inheritance is the building itself and the knowledge we have passed down within it. That is something no one can ever take from you. It has no market value, and because of that, it is invaluable. The roof will need attention first. The northern exposure has taken a beating from the winters. There is a man in town, Silas Croft. His father helped me put the first new roof on this place 30 years ago. Silas is an honest man and a fine craftsman. He understands old buildings. Tell him you are Clara's daughter. He will treat you fairly. The well pump might need priming, and the old generator can be cantankerous, but it is a good machine. It just needs a firm, patient hand. All the important things do. This work we do, Nora, It is not a hobby. It is a conversation with time. We take what is broken and we make it whole again. We take what is forgotten and we give it a future. There is a quiet power in that. In a world that is always rushing toward the next new thing, we have the patience to honor what has been. Do not let anyone ever tell you that this is not important. It is. It is the most important thing. It is the work of holding our world together. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with the work. The wood will teach you everything you need to know if you are quiet enough to listen. All my love, Mama. Nora sat in the cold, dusty darkness of the workshop and read the letter again, and then a third time. The knot of grief in her chest, the one that had been frozen solid since she saw her tool chests on the sidewalk, finally began to melt. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound and overwhelming sense of relief, of being seen and understood in a way she had not realized she had been missing for so long. Her mother had known. She had anticipated a moment just like this one, a moment when Nora would be broken and lost, and she had left her a map, a key, and a reason to begin again. The letter was a gift more precious than the gold, a validation that settled deep in her bones. She was not adrift, she was anchored. The next morning, Nora woke with the sun, stiff from a night spent on a pile of old canvas dropcloths. The first light streamed through the tall, dirty windows, illuminating the vast space in a way that felt holy. The air was cold, but the light was full of promise. She found an old hand pump in a small utility room off the main floor. As her mother's letter had predicted, it needed priming. After 20 minutes of strenuous, rhythmic work, the pump sputtered and coughed and then finally delivered a stream of clear, cold, sweet-tasting water. She washed her face and hands, the icy water a shocking, welcome jolt to her system. Her first task was to clean. She spent the entire day in a whirlwind of labor. She opened the massive sliding doors, flooding the workshop with fresh air and sunlight. She swept away years of accumulated dust and cobwebs, the rhythmic scrape of the broom on the stone floor a kind of meditation. She wiped down the workbench, her mother's tools, the surfaces of the lathes and saws. With every stroke of the rag, with every cloud of dust she sent billowing out into the sunlight, she felt she was not just cleaning a space, but clearing her own mind, reclaiming herself. The following day, she called Silas Croft. His voice on the phone was gruff but not unkind. When she said she was Clara Voss's daughter, the tone of his voice changed instantly, softening with respect. "Clara," he said, a warmth spreading through the word. She was a true artist, one of the finest craftspeople this state has ever seen. I'll be out this afternoon to take a look. He arrived in a battered pickup truck, a tall, lean man in his late 50s with work-roughened hands and kind eyes. He walked the perimeter of the carriage house, his gaze expert and assessing. He climbed a ladder to the roof, Nora following close behind. He pointed out the places where the slate had cracked, where the flashing had pulled away from the chimney. "Your mother was right to be concerned," he said. "Another winter or two, and you'd have real trouble. But the bones are good. She built this to last." He quoted her a price that was startlingly fair. "For Clara's daughter," he said by way of explanation. "We'll start next week." When Silas and his small crew arrived, Nora did not retreat into the workshop. She was out there with them. She helped them tear off the old, damaged slates, her muscles quickly aching with the unfamiliar labor. She learned to use a slate ripper and a hammer. Her movements, clumsy at first, growing more confident with each passing day. Silas, seeing her determination and her aptitude, began to teach her, showing her how to cut the new slate to fit, how to nail it into place without cracking it, how to seal the joints so they would hold against 100 years of wind and snow. The work was hard, physical, and deeply satisfying. She felt her body growing stronger, her focus narrowing to the simple, honest task at hand. The community of the work was a balm as well. The men were quiet and respectful, and they treated her as a colleague, not a client. They shared coffee with her in the mornings and beer in the cool evenings, their conversation easy and centered on the practicalities of their work. They told her stories about her mother, small anecdotes of her kindness, her skill, her stubborn refusal to compromise on quality. Through them, Nora began to see her mother not just as a parent, but as a respected member of a community of makers, a woman who had earned her place through skill and integrity. After the roof was finished, a beautiful expanse of dark gray slate that shone in the sun, Nora turned her attention to the interior. She spent weeks bringing the workshop back to life. She meticulously cleaned and sharpened every one of her mother's hand tools, feeling a deep connection to the woman whose hands had shaped their wooden handles. She organized her own tools alongside them, integrating her life into the space. She rewired the old, frayed electrical system, installed new, brighter lights above the workbench, and got the cantankerous generator running with a combination of patience and stubbornness, just as her mother had advised. She transformed the hayloft into a clean, organized space for lumber storage and finishing work, the northern light perfect for seeing the true color of a stain or varnish. The carriage house was no longer a dusty relic. It was becoming a living, breathing workshop again, filled with the scent of sawdust and the sounds of her work. To support herself while she established her new business, she took a part-time position at the Regional Historical Museum, a small but well-regarded institution in a nearby town. The director, a woman named Eleanor Vance, had known Clara well and had often hired her for conservation work on the museum's collection. When she saw Nora's portfolio, she hired her on the spot. "You have your mother's eye," Eleanor told her, her voice full of warmth. "And her hands." Nora was given the title of Wood Conservator and tasked with the care of the museum's collection of 18th and 19th century furniture. The work was delicate, demanding, and deeply fulfilling. It connected her professional skills to her new home, grounding her in the history of the region. She spent her days at the museum, painstakingly restoring a delicate Sheraton sideboard or a heavily carved Hadley chest, and her evenings and weekends in her own workshop, taking on small commissions from locals who had heard that Clara Voss's daughter was back in town and open for business. Her life settled into a quiet, productive rhythm. The days were marked by the focused, meditative work of her hands. The seasons turned. Autumn arrived, setting the Vermont hills on fire with color. Winter followed, burying the carriage house in a deep, insulating blanket of snow. Nora spent the cold months inside, the workshop warmed by a new wood stove, the air fragrant with the smell of burning maple. She found a deep contentment in her solitude, a peace she had never known in the noisy, crowded city. She was not lonely. The carriage house itself felt like a presence, a quiet, steady companion. Her mother's spirit was in the tools, in the workbench, in the very light that filled the space, and slowly the community began to find its way to her. An elderly, retired cabinet maker would stop by once a week with a thermos of coffee just to talk about wood. A local artist came to sketch the carriage house, fascinated by its stark, honest beauty. Old friends of her mother would visit, bringing pies and stories, their presence a quiet affirmation that she belonged here. She was not just Nora, the woman who had been left on a sidewalk. She was Nora Voss, Clara's daughter, the keeper of the carriage house. She was home. Spring arrived with a slow, gentle thaw, the world outside her workshop turning from white to brown to a vibrant, electric green. The days grew longer, warmer. She took to working outside in the afternoons, setting up a temporary workbench in the sunshine to take advantage of the perfect drying weather for her finishes. It was on one such afternoon in late May, the air sweet with the scent of lilacs and freshly cut grass, that he arrived. She was so absorbed in her work, the delicate process of French polishing a small mahogany side table, that she did not hear the car until it was already crunching to a stop on the gravel drive. It was a sleek, silver German sedan, absurdly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the old stone building. She looked up, her hand pausing mid-stroke. Owen Hart unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was wearing cream-colored linen trousers, a navy blazer, and expensive leather loafers with no socks. He looked like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement for a weekend in the Hamptons. He looked utterly, completely ridiculous. He stood for a long moment, simply staring, his mouth slightly agape. He took in the restored carriage house, the new slate roof gleaming in the sun, the freshly painted trim on the windows, the neat stacks of firewood along the wall. He looked at the heavy, timber-framed workbench she was using, at the array of tools laid out neatly beside her. He looked at her. She was wearing dusty work pants and a simple t-shirt, her hair tied back in a messy bun. There was a smudge of polish on her cheek. She did not look like the curated artisan he used to show off to his clients. She looked strong, competent, and completely at peace. The sight of her, so rooted and self-possessed in this place he never knew existed, seemed to fundamentally bewilder him. "Nora," he said, his voice hesitant. It was the first time she had heard it in almost a year. It sounded thin and unsubstantial in the open air. She did not stand up. She did not wipe the smudge from her cheek. She picked up her polishing pad, a small wad of cotton wrapped in linen, charged it with a bit of alcohol and shellac, and resumed her work, her hand moving in a steady, circular motion over the surface of the table. "Owen," she said, her voice calm and even. She did not look at him. She looked at the wood, at the way the finish was beginning to build, creating a deep, liquid-like luster. He walked closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet away, looking around as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. I had no idea about this place," he said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, an admission of a logistical oversight. He was the brand strategist who had failed to conduct a thorough audit of his assets. "No," she said, still not looking up. "You didn't." She continued her polishing, the rhythmic whisper of the pad on the wood the only sound between them for a long moment. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for him, but not for her. This was her space, her silence. He was the intruder. "It's incredible," he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the building. The property value alone must be significant. You've done a lot of work." He was appraising it, calculating its worth, translating it back into a language he could understand. He saw a renovated building on a desirable piece of rural land. He did not see a sanctuary, a legacy, a home. "I have," she agreed. She paused her work and finally lifted her head, looking at him directly for the first time. Her gaze was clear and steady, without anger or bitterness. It was simply observant. "You never asked, you know. Not once. You never asked about my mother, or where I learned to do this, or what my life was like before I met you. You never asked what she left me." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I was busy. We were building a life." "You were building a brand," she corrected him, her voice gentle but precise. "And when my part of the brand no longer fit the portfolio, you liquidated." He looked down at his shoes, then back at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, confusion, perhaps, or a dawning, unwelcome self-awareness. "I was wrong," he said, "the way I handled it. It was inefficient." He chose the wrong word, a word from his world, not hers. He still did not understand. He took a small step closer. "Nora, is there any way to fix this? To restore what we had?" Nora held his gaze. She thought of the broken Biedermeier chairs, of the cracked Hadley chest, of the shattered veneer on the table in front of her. She thought of the patient, respectful work of restoration, of mending what was broken, of honoring the history of a thing. And she thought of the clean break he had made, the calculated efficiency of his departure, the fundamental hollowness at the core of what they had shared. Some things could not be restored because their core integrity was gone. Some things were not meant to be fixed, only to be left behind. She gave him a small, sad smile. It was not unkind. It was simply final. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolutely clear. "There isn't." He stared at her for a moment longer, as if waiting for a different answer, a negotiation, another term. But there was none. He had reached the end of the transaction. He nodded slowly, a single sharp dip of his head. He turned without another word, walked back to his gleaming silver car, and drove away, leaving behind only a small cloud of dust that quickly settled in the warm afternoon air. Nora watched him go. She felt no triumph, no anger, only a quiet, calm clarity. She turned back to her work, picked up her polishing pad, and continued her slow, patient circles, her attention returning fully to the wood, to the craft, to the thing that was real and lasting. That evening she stayed in the workshop long after the sun had gone down. She worked by the warm, focused light of a single lamp hanging over her mother's workbench. The large doors were open to the cool night air, which carried the scent of damp earth and blooming peonies. Outside, the stars were brilliant in the black Vermont sky, a sight she had almost forgotten existed. She was not working on a commission. She was working on a small, simple box for herself, carving a set of dovetail joints into a piece of cherry wood she had selected from her mother's collection. Her chisel was sharp, her movements precise and unhurried. The gentle tap of her mallet, the soft scrape of the blade against the wood, these were the only sounds. She thought about the generations of her family, the quiet, competent people who had passed this knowledge down through their hands. She thought of her mother, whose presence felt as solid and real as the workbench beneath her elbows. She thought of Owen, a man who lived in a world of surfaces, who could see the price of everything and the value of nothing. He had walked into her life and taken everything he believed was of worth, everything he could count and carry and document. He had taken the sofa and the art. He had taken the money in the bank. He had left her on a sidewalk with nothing but her tools and the clothes she was wearing. But he had left behind the only thing that mattered. He had left her the history that lived in her hands. He had left her the resilience she had inherited from her mother. He had left her the quiet, unshakable knowledge of who she was. He forgot the old carriage house her mother left. It was the best thing he ever forgot.